Getting started in just a moment. Good evening, good evening. If you're here, let me know in the comments that you're here. And thanks for joining me. All right. All right. Well, let's get started. So, good evening, everyone. And if you're watching the replay, let me know by dropping hashtag replay in the comments. I love to see who's watching and who is tapping into this. And so we're going to get started with this week's editions of Conversations about Equity in Music Education. Today, I have two questions that I pulled from recent workshops that I've done. I just did a workshop actually last night, a mini workshop. So if you happen to be there, thank you for joining me. It was a great one. It was the first time I had done that one where I talked more specifically about moving away from traditional methods of creating music curriculum and what I see as what we need to do as far as how to shift to make culturally responsive and equitable teaching practices a central piece to the way that we design curriculum. So it was really fun to be able to do that. I love talking about curriculum stuff. Probably one of my favorite things to talk about and support music educators with. And so I pulled the first one from that workshop and then another one from another recent one that I've done. But before I jump in, let me quickly introduce myself in case this is the first time that you're happening upon me on these internet streets. My name is Ashley Cuthbertson. I use the pronouns she, her. I'm a music educator. When I was in the classroom, I taught infants through adults, but mostly K through 12. So I taught pretty much everything. So I taught general music, I taught choir, I taught band. I was a musicianship teacher for our local choral society where I worked with the students on their music literacy and vocal harmony skills. I also have served as an adjunct professor, mostly with actually all of my graduate courses have been with graduate music educators, so in-service music teachers who are working towards their master's degree. A new teacher coach, a mentor, and now a consultant. So now I work full-time in my educational consulting firm that I founded, a Cuthbertson Consulting, and we help music educators build and maintain high-quality music programs that attract, engage, and retain music students through the skillful utilization of culturally responsive and equitable teaching practices that make learning accessible for all of our students in their curriculum and instruction. And so I work full-time, mostly supporting music educators through their schools, their school districts, and their organizations. And so I've been coming on here, all the places live every Tuesday in November, because I also, I do these like monthly workshops. Like I just said, I did one, but I knew that I've been doing like free workshops, but I also do longer, more deep dive workshops virtually. And I know that with November, it's just a hard month for music teachers. We've got performances. If you're also that we're preparing for and doing, if you're also happening to be somebody who gigs on the side, or if you have a church job, I know this is also a really busy time as we happen upon the holidays. And so instead of doing a full-blown deep dive workshop like I've been doing on Saturdays, I decided I would just come on live and do some kind of informal chats and answer questions that I get frequently asked at the professional development workshops that I do for music educators. And so this has actually been really fun to come on and just chat and answer questions. And so if you have a question live, let me know in the comments and I will answer it. And if you happen to catch this later on, still drop your questions into the comments, or you can also send me a DM, because I'm thinking that this is something I might continue to do even going into December and beyond. And so let me know what questions you'd like for me to answer. But I'm going to go ahead and jump right on in. I have, like I said, two questions that I pulled for this evening's Conversations about Equity in Music Education, and then I'll take any live questions I see as well. So the first question was, and I've been getting a variety of this kind of question. So I didn't write the exact words because I've been getting several questions that all have to do with how do we support students with disabilities. And so I prefaced answering this question with a little bit of context about me and my time working with students in particular. So my journey along this equity, diversity, inclusion road actually began because I taught at a school, wonderful school here I didn't tell you where I'm from. I'm from here in the Northern Virginia area, just outside DC. And so I was teaching at a wonderful school, wonderful kids, wonderful community, wonderful colleagues, great school. I taught there for several years. But I kept noticing this phenomenon. I don't know if phenomenon is the right word, but I kept noticing this thing was happening. And so I'd be teaching, lessons. We would get to, touch a couple lessons. Now it's time for our assessment. Hey, Tanzere, thanks for joining. I'll get to the assessment at the end. And even though the lessons felt like they were going really well, we're rocking and rolling, it would come to the assessment time. And it was always like very telling that so many students were struggling to achieve what I was hoping they would achieve on the assessment. And as I got into refining my teaching practices and really targeting certain students to support them better, I was able to kind of correct that. But then even with all these differentiation strategies and figuring out better ways to just do better assessment, that was one of the things I learned, was that first of all, you can't just wait until the end of the unit to assess. There needs to be some pre-assessing, some formative before you get to the summative, right? But then even then I noticed that pretty predictably, it was always my students with disabilities that were continuing to struggle no matter what it seemed that I was doing. They were struggling both like musically, academically. They were also struggling behaviorally. They were struggling emotionally. Like they were having some troubles, and it was very predictable who it was going to be that was going to be having troubles. And that in itself is like a very clear example of inequity that was happening in action in my music room, right? And so as I was thinking about this and pondering and realizing like, wow, this is super inequitable, that I know that these students are going to continue to struggle, that led me to really that led me to what I do now, which is I'm really passionate about making sure that all of our students thrive, regardless of their background, regardless of their ability. All of our students deserve a high quality music education. And that just means that teachers need to have better support, better access to resources to be able to create curricular and music programs that really can be flexible enough to support any kind of learner. And so I don't know that I share that story often enough, because I think often when people hear me speak, because I talk a lot about culturally responsive and equitable practices, I think people get so confused when they hear that word cultural. They immediately think race, ethnicity. But as I was saying to my folks yesterday at our workshop, culture is just the common value systems and beliefs of a group of people. Culture is not just referring to race or ethnicity. It refers to all the beautiful multifacets of any one person's identity. And we're all many, many things, right? I'm not just a Black woman, right? There's so many more parts to me than just the race that you can see, right? And so I think when people hear that word culture or culturally responsive, there's this confusion, and think folks immediately go to like language, right? Because language is a part of culture. They immediately go to the racial diversity that they might be having in their classroom with their students. But I encourage you to expand a little bit on that and remember that culture is not just race and ethnicity. And then I'm very purposeful. You'll notice when I talk about what's the work that I do, I don't just say I support music educators with culturally responsive practices. I'm very intentional in saying I support music educators with equitable and culturally responsive practices that allow for accessibility in their music classrooms. And I use all of those terms very purposefully because I think it's important that we remember that us in the DEI space, our aim is not just to, racial justice is obviously a part of that, but that's not the only thing, right? We also want to make sure that we erase inequities wherever they may be lying, right? And so I think, especially with, it's now 2 years later from like the racial uprisings from the summer of 2020 following the murder of George Floyd, right? Where I think a lot of people got woke and the racial reckoning happened. And I still think that there's some residual effects of people still being kind of confused about what DEI means, what culturally responsive and accessible means. So I encourage you to really expand your mind and as far as what you're thinking in regards to that, because it's not just about how do we support students who have racial differences. It's about how do we support students, period, right? And so I think before I answer this question, how do we support students with disabilities? I think it's important for me to preface it with all of those words that I just said to you. So with that being said, the question, I think I remember the question I got yesterday, but I've been getting this question quite often. I just did 2 conference appearances this month, both at the NAFME conference, which was here in the DC area, and then also in Virginia, our state conference in Richmond. And then yesterday I got the question. Yesterday's question is more fresh in my mind. So the teacher was asking, often folks in the DEI space, like myself, are often talking about like racial differences. Although I don't think she used that terminology, but this teacher was asking, how do we make sure that students who are not just racialized, basically, and marginalized by their race. Students who may have, I believe that teacher used the term like invisible identities. How do we make sure that those students are also getting appropriate support? And so, when I hear that question asking about students with disabilities, as I said before, I'm hearing confusion about what culturally responsive means, confusion about what does equity mean, because equity is eliminating, barriers and obstacles wherever they may be for whomever they might be, right? And so, a couple of things that I wrote down about supporting our students with disabilities in the music room. And so, I really believe, and for those of you that have been with me for a while, you probably heard me say, I really believe that we're all special learners. And I told you that little story about the school I taught at, where I realized that inequity was an action in my classroom because it was very predictable who the students were that were going to struggle. And it was always my students with disabilities until I figured things out and learned how to be better, basically. But part of me learning to be better was that I realized, it dawned on me that, the labels that, an IEP may put on a child, or a 504 might put on a child, or maybe the child doesn't have a formalized program or plan in place, but like it's clear that there's something going on. Those labels are, of course, helpful. It definitely gives educators and other professionals that work with those individuals and those kids direction as far as best supports for them. But I think also the labels get in our way too. And so I was thinking, as I was thinking about this question, I was thinking about one of my grad school professors, Dr. Alice Hamill, and her book that she wrote with Dr. Ryan Horrigan, A Label-Free Approach to Working with, Teaching Students with Disabilities in the Music Classroom. And I really think that like the title of the book itself is a key takeaway, I think, from how I think about my work with my kids in my classroom, was that the labels, of course, were helpful, but the labels actually sometimes got in the way, because sometimes it unintentionally caused me to kind of pigeonhole students by their label, instead of just looking at them as the beautiful, gifted, genius individual that they were and are, right? And so, thinking about how do we support students with disabilities, I would instead think of a reframe for you. Instead of how do I best support students with disabilities, I would say, how do I best make sure that my classroom is free of as many barriers and obstacles as possible, so that any student, regardless of ability, a level, or background, will be able to be successful. And I love this quote from Dr. Guldi Muhammad, who I love, and adore, in her book, Cultivating Genius. Or was it in her book, or maybe she said it somewhere else, but, what will you do to make it impossible for students to fail? And I know she wasn't saying that specifically in regards to like students with disabilities or marginalized identities of students, but I think in the reframe that I present to you, instead of thinking about how do I help this child with a disability, and thinking how do I just make sure that my classroom and my curriculum is free of barriers and obstacles, I just encourage you to think bigger, right? Of course, we know that there are students in our classrooms that we want to attract, engage, and retain in our music classrooms, that are going to have more, that are going to be in need of more intensive supports, right? And so I'm thinking about for many years, I taught in schools that had enhanced autism programs. And so my students in those classes who loved music, right? Music is so wonderful in that way that it connects with folks. But oftentimes my students in my enhanced autism classrooms, the way that I would work to communicate with them would often have to be, I have to move away from relying on like verbal responses, because they might not verbally decide to verbally communicate with me. And it wasn't about necessarily their ability to, it was more about what is their preference and what is the best way for them that they choose to want to communicate, right? And so the universal design for learning principles can be helpful in this regard if you're looking for like some specific framework for like how do I reduce and remove obstacles and barriers in my learning environment and my curriculum instruction for my students, especially for any student, but maybe in particular if you have a particular kiddo that you're thinking about, making sure that they are thriving in your classroom, and it's not clearly obvious that they're going to be the one that's going to struggle, because that's inequitable. That's inequity at work if you're noticing that. You can predict that student's going to continue to have a hard time. And so you can look at, what are things in my learning environment that I need to put in place for a student that is that communicating verbally is not going to be it for them. What are other ways that I am embedding into my lessons and unit plans? What are other ways that I'm putting in for there to be a variety of ways for them to communicate? Or am I only relying on verbal English, communication ways? Like, are there a variety of options for students to be able to communicate? So that could look like a child who, communicating verbally is not going to be their jam. Are there some images that you could present that child? Often in my enhanced autism classes, I would use lots and lots of icons right up on the board, but also like, I don't know, my notebook, can serve as, I would give them like a paper that had icons of things that we were doing in the songs or the concepts that we were doing. So maybe they weren't verbally communicating with me their understanding. They could point, they could track, they could do something else, right? So there was another way that I provided in my classroom for them to be able to communicate their understanding with me that did not rely on them having to speak to me. That same tactic, I guess if you want to call it, or strategy, also worked when I worked with students who are multilingual, right? So am I providing options for language, not just like students who are not going to necessarily talk to me, but students who are going to speak in English, right? English happens to be the language that I use and am most fluent in, but that might not be the case for my students, right? So icons and pictures and giving other ways for students to show what they know is really key in that particular regard. So I just offer that as one particular strategy that you might consider if you are finding that it's becoming predictable in your classroom that your students with disabilities are struggling, and how that might help you to create a more equitable space for them. But in general, as I said before, I also encourage you to expand your mind. Instead of thinking, how can I support my students with disabilities? A reframe, right? How can I ensure that my music classroom environment, my curriculum, my instruction is free of barriers and obstacles? And barriers and obstacles come in all shapes and forms. So a barrier might be that you are only communicating in English. That could be a barrier for somebody who's multilingual. A barrier could be, or obstacle could be, that you're not using any visuals to support the content that you're presenting. That's going to be an issue for students who have disabilities with processing and cognition. It's also going to be a barrier or an obstacle for multilingual students. People like me who just need more processing time. Like, I don't have a particular identified disability, but your girl needs some visuals sometimes and time to be able to think, right? So that's going to be an obstacle barrier for actually a lot of kids, not just the ones for whom the label has been identified. And that's how we create equity, right? Is we don't just think about, when I presented with this particular student, how I'm going to do like modifications and accommodations and things, but how am I just going to make sure that my space, my learning environment and curriculum is going to be accessible? There's that word accessibility, right? That I said I'm purposeful in using, but how can I make sure that it's accessible for everybody? So I offer that as kind of a reframe for you and the work that you're doing with your students. Something maybe just to think about and to consider as you're going about your work with your kids in your music classrooms. All right, so I have one more question to answer today. I was looking to see if there were any live questions. I don't see any, so this is your chance. If I see a couple of people popping in and out, if you have a question, drop it in the chat. I'll answer it after this next one. So the second question that I pulled, and I will read exactly what this person said. This person asks, how do I navigate picking pieces for performance or informance from various cultures without falling into the zone of appropriation? And I love this question because I love that this music educator and many music educators that I've worked with are really working hard to correct many of the wrongs that we know have happened, especially in the repertoire selections that we're presented with from publishers and other music creating resource folks, right? Unfortunately, there's a lot of appropriation that's happened. And I love that more of us are working to make sure that we're more informed about the repertoire choices that we're making, that we're more aware of the stories and the context behind the repertoire choices that we're making and presenting to our students, and that we're actively working to not appropriate somebody's culture, right? And so to speak specifically to this question, how do we avoid falling into appropriation? We do those things I just named. So you make sure that when you come across a piece of music, whether you come across it because you have a book and you're opening and you're looking through it, or maybe you're online, you're listening to something, or if you're like me and still use CDs, maybe you have a CD that somebody has given you and you come across it, or you are at a conference session and you hear, however you come across your music, that you make sure that before you're presenting it to your students, that you know the basic who, what, when, where, why, how, and the purpose of that piece of music. And I say the basic because that's the very least that I think that we can do, is to make sure that we know like the basic who, what, when, where, all those question kind of things. I also encourage music educators to go a little bit deeper. Now, I know the issue with that is that we don't have a lot of time, right? I was like you. Sometimes I had years where I taught 9 and 10 classes in a day. And so I totally get, like, some days we don't have time to do all the things that we want to do, right? And I know that's a very real issue in our music education community, that we just don't, and we don't have equitable access to planning, right? Some years I had a great schedule where I had, an hour in the morning, hour in the afternoon most days. And then I had schedules where I would teach literally all day and have a half hour lunch, right? So I know that there's that inequity that also exists. And I would, besides obviously putting more pressure on our publishers to do better, to provide us with high quality resources that give us this information so we don't have to hunt and peck all over the internet, I still present to you another reframe of like, do you want to be in a position where you find out later that you've presented a piece of music to your students that you later find out is harmful, right? I know that, especially if you're watching me and listening to this, I know that you care about your students and you care about their education, their musical education. And I know that you don't want that to happen. And so with that thought of like, oh my God, I don't have a lot of time. Also, there's the thought of what happens if I present a problematic song or a song that is appropriating someone's culture. I would say to that, if you really don't have the time, then don't use that song, right? Stick to stuff that you know that you can present and is going to be not just a fulfilling experience musically, but it's going to not be a harmful experience on the back end when students or you find out more information, right? And I think we all have access to Google, and there's free information everywhere for you to be able to avoid that kind of problem. So number one, make sure you know the basic who, what, when, where, why, how, and the purpose of the pieces of music. Then go a little bit deeper, right? Who, not just what's the name of the person, the who, but like, who actually are they? Like, what's their story? What's their deal? Are they still living? Are they not? How did they live? Find out about, if it's a folk song, find out about the culture from which it comes. Find out more information, right? Not only does this help you to be better informed, but it helps you to make sure that you can teach that to your kids, right? We know that music is not just the notes on the page, and we have to move away from music curriculum that just teaches us to teach techniques and skills and concepts. We need to be more intentional, folks, about making sure that we remember that music is not just the notes. Music is the people and the culture as well, right? Music is a mainstay in cultures everywhere. It doesn't matter what it is. Additionally, as we try to avoid the appropriation piece, we have to keep in mind that not all music is for everybody and is for consumption for all people all the time, right? So I think an unfortunate part of white supremacy that we see that seeps into all of our systems, including music education, is that there's a sense of entitlement to just take and take and take, and that one is entitled to be able to do that simply by the virtue of you want to, right? And so I encourage you to remember that not all music is for all people. Not all music is for you to perform in your classroom either, right? Some music is sacred. Some music is not meant for study in an academic way, right? And so understanding the who, what, when, where, how, and the purpose, right? When you understand the purpose of that piece of music, that's a key way for you to make sure that you're not appropriating somebody's culture by using, a religious song for, musical analysis of the melody, right? That's not an appropriate use of that song. That's not what it was for. And that's not what you would want your students to ultimately gain, I hope, from that piece of music. So how do we avoid appropriating in that sense is we have to know the purpose, and we have to accept those times when we learn that the purpose is not going to allow us to use it in our music classrooms. Sometimes, as this teacher was asking, how do I pick pieces for performance or informance? Some pieces of music, while it might be fine for us to engage with it, it might not be fine for us to engage with it on a performance level, right? So the engagement with that piece of music might be listening and discussion. And that's how we make sure that we don't appropriate, right? Because to perform, again, a sacred piece of music or a piece of music used for a particular ritual or moment in life, I'm drawing a blank, but hopefully you're with me, right? A piece of music that's used for a very, very specific cultural purpose, right, to use it for like performing on a stage would not be in alignment with that purpose, right? So doesn't mean necessarily that we don't engage with that. It means that we don't use it for performance because now we're using it for our own gain, right? But instead, maybe that's a piece that you use to listen, to spark discussion, to engage with in a responding and connecting way, and not so it's a performing and creating kind of way. So I encourage you to continue to think about those things. And I love this question, but continue to think about those things as you're choosing repertoire, right? We know that just diversifying your repertoire is not culturally responsive. And if you've been with me for a while, you've heard me explain more. So I won't go all the way into like why that is, but culture responsive teaching isn't just about having diverse repertoire, right? That's multiculturalism. Culture responsive teaching calls on us as teachers to make sure that we're tapping into the brain power of our students and utilizing their cultural frames of reference to make the learning more contextualized and more relevant to them, right? You can't do that just by diversifying your repertoire, because part of how we make sure that we're relevant is that we also look at the way that we're teaching, our instructional practices. And so to just diversify your repertoire, but you don't adjust your teaching practices, can still be problematic, right? And so as you're continuing to think about how to incorporate music from diverse cultures, diverse places, diverse genres as well, I encourage you to continue to think about how can you best use the music to do more than just teach the notes on the page, to also think about how you can select music and contextualize it for your students so that they're learning, about discernment, about the world around them, people different from them, not better or worse, but different from them, and also for themselves. And then also consider how you can use that, how that music will best be served, right? Sometimes the best way to serve that piece of music is not performing it. It might be engaging and listening or something, as I just offered. So that's what I offer to you, but also to this teacher if they happen to be listening. All right, so that's all I had for tonight. I'm just looking to see real quick, if I have any other questions. I don't. All right, so like I said, I'm Ashley Cuthbertson, and I have been coming live every Tuesday in November, and I am probably going to continue to do something like this. Maybe not every single week, but something like this where I'll come on live and continue to have these conversations with you all. So thank you for tapping in. Those of you that popped in and out live, those of you that are watching the replay, let me know. Hashtag replay in the comments so I can see who's tapping in. But let me know what questions you have. Also, let me know what topics you might want me to discuss next time. I'm thinking next time, instead of answering questions like I've been doing these last several weeks, I'm going to just pick one topic and talk about it. So let me know what topics you want me to chat about, discuss, and also let me know what other questions you'd like for me to pull up and discuss for my my further live streams. All right, well, have a good evening or morning or afternoon, whenever you might be watching this, and I hope to talk with you again soon.